Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Thanks for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. My name is Nathan Kiker, along with my co-host, Carson Becker. Our guest today is James M. Scott, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, New York Times bestselling author, and one of the most respected military historians of his generation. He's the author of several acclaimed works, including Black Snow, Rampage, Target, Tokyo, The War Below, The Attacks on the Liberty, and he's the author of the new bestselling book, Targeted Beirut, with Jack Carr. Before we dive into our interview with James, let's take a look at the news of today. Massive May Day protests are taking place across the U.S. and worldwide, with thousands rallying for workers' rights, social justice, and against President Trump's administration and its policies. Demonstrators are demanding protections for Medicare, Social Security, public services, and immigrant rights, while opposing job cuts and attacks on unions and marginalized communities. The protests mark President Trump's 100th day in office amid declining approval ratings and heightened political tension. President Trump also announced the firing of his national security advisor, Mike Waltz, replacing him with existing Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. With that, let's jump into our interview with James Scott. James, thanks for joining us.
Thank you guys for having me on.
Yeah, so look, you recently were co-author to Targeted Beirut. For readers unfamiliar with the events of October 23rd, 1983, can you describe what happened that morning in the Marine barracks in Beirut and why it was such a turning point for the U.S. Marines in American foreign policy?
Yeah, absolutely. To rewind 4 decades back to October of 83, it was the Hezbollah attack on the U.S. Marine headquarters and barracks in Beirut. And it was a Sunday morning. It was a truck bomb, and it was also the largest non-nuclear explosion the FBI had ever investigated. And it was a catastrophic terrorist attack against American peacekeepers who had been deployed to Lebanon to help prop up their government and bring stability to a nation that had long suffered under civil war. And the terrorist attack that morning ultimately claimed the lives of 241 American Marines, sailors, and soldiers, and was, at that point, really a huge wake-up blow for the United States. I mean, this is, of course, you have to remember, you have to rewind back to pre-9/11, pre the First World Trade Center, pre the Cole, pre so many of these sort of benchmarks in America's long march down the road of terrorism that are familiar to us today. This was really the beginning of it, and it really kind of set the pace, and it set the tone for what we would see play out over the last 4 decades.
What led you to write this book with Jack Carr?
Yeah, so actually it was Jack's idea, and Jack was looking to start a series of books. Of course, for folks who may not know Jack, and I can't imagine there are not a lot that don't. He's a really big name, but Jack is a former Navy SEAL, and he's a thriller writer. He's the author of the Terminal List series, which was made into a very popular television show with Chris Pratt. Excellent show, and the second season's been filming recently. So give a little plug to Jack's TV projects there. But Jack was looking to start to sort of branch out into nonfiction, sort of follow the path that folks like Tom Clancy had done prior to him. And so he wanted, though, to take a look at sort of modern terrorism and sort of look at, do true history accounts, using archival research, interviews, things like that. And sort of tell these stories, remind readers of these events, these pivotal events in American history. And so he wanted to team up with somebody who had more of a background in history and had spent time in the archives and doing that kind of stuff. And he had read some of my work. And so he reached out to me a couple of years ago and asked if I was interested in coming on board. And of course, I was very much intrigued by the idea. In fact, Jack had reached out to me, and I was literally on my way out the door that weekend to a World War II conference of all things. And I was having dinner that weekend with the former director of Marine Corps history by the name of Dr. Charlie Niemeyer. And I mentioned to him at dinner, I said, Charlie, I've been approached about this project on the Beirut attacks. I said, you're former director of Marine Corps history. What do you guys have in the archives related to this? And he said, James, we've got everything. He said, we've got the monthly command histories, the weekly situation reports. We've got the daily message traffic. We've even got an oral history series that was done right around the time of the bombing. And so I was like, oh, wow. And furthermore, Charlie said, this story really needs to be redone. And so after dinner and flying back that weekend, I remembered a buddy of mine who'd been in my graduate program at the Citadel and had mentioned in one of our classes that he'd been involved in things that had happened in Beirut. And so I texted Mark and I said, Mark, you'd mentioned connection to Beirut. Like, remind me what that was. And he texted me back and he said, hey, I was one of the rescuers. And so I called him as I'm really running between gates here. And I was like, what? Tell me more about it. And he's like, yeah, I was there. I was digging in the rubble pile. I can put you in touch with, all the guys that worked with me and things like that. And so I literally got home. I called Jack and I said, the director of Marine Corps history tells me he's got all the archival research that we need to do it. A buddy of mine was there, can tell us what his experience was like, put us in touch with the others. It's like, man, all I'm seeing are green lights here. This is go, 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 and we need to jump on this project. And so we did. And so literally we started the research, started the interview process. Did time in the Marine Corps archives, the Reagan Library, other smaller archives. Did over 100 hours of interviews with survivors who were there, family members, loved ones, in order to tell this story. So it was really a lot of fun, and I think a really fascinating project to work on. And I think the book turned out very well.
Yeah, I obviously want to let Carson jump in, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask a quick follow-up. We, of course, know what happened in the 42 years since the bombing and sort of how that started this process, which I want to dive into momentarily. But give us an overview of what the region was like before the conflict. One, why were our soldiers there? Two, what problem are they trying to solve? And then how was the U.S. perceived in the Middle East before 1983?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's an important one too, because folks do need that context. And so, Lebanon basically had, in the wake of World War II, had it's a multi-faith nation, and it had sort of been held together through a gentleman's agreement that had come out of the 1940s, in which power was essentially split between the three dominant faiths there. You had the Christians were the largest, and so they held the most power. And then you had the Sunnis, Muslims, and they were sort of the second largest. And so they had, they held the head of parliament. And then you had the smaller faith, which was the Shias. And so they were then controlled the house, basically. And so you had this sort of power sharing structure. And what had happened, of course, since the end of World War II and up through the 1970s, of course, as demographics changed. And so you saw the Christians suddenly, became a smaller group, and you saw a rise in the Shias and the Sunnis. And so what happened is it became a power struggle. Other groups wanted a bigger piece of the power pie. And that eventually led to a huge civil war in the 1970s. And so as this sort of domestic civil war is playing out and Lebanon sort of spirals into chaos, other outside groups start coming in. And you've got the Palestine Liberation Organization is there, and they're using Lebanon as a place to attack Israel. You've got the Syrians; they want a share of Lebanon, and of course, so they're sort of there monkeying around as well. And then, of course, the Iranians are eventually going to come in as well and see an opportunity in this chaos to sort of export their revolution. And so you really have a mess. It is a domestic mess of sort of an internal power struggle. And laid on top of that is this external struggle of all these outside actors that are coming into Lebanon. And so what happens is the U.S. goes in 1982 alongside the French, the Italians, and the British to try and bring some sense of peace and stability. And so we go in initially trying to get the PLO out. And after the PLO leaves, which is a very successful operation, you then see a huge massacre inside one of the Palestinian refugee camps. So once the Palestinian fighters are out, there's a huge massacre. So at that point, the U.S. goes back in. And at this point, the U.S. doesn't have a clear mission. We're going back in as peacekeepers, but it's like, we really don't have a clear set of objectives and goals of what we're trying to accomplish. And it's because of this open-ended mission that the Marines sort of get stuck there. And then what happens is 82 rolls into 83, the conditions in Lebanon begin to deteriorate again. And once again, it becomes like the Wild West. Groups start fighting one another, there are mortar attacks, there's artillery duels, all of this. And ringside to all this chaos and violence are the U.S. Marines.
One of the major players in this period, of course, was Hafez al-Assad of Syria. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, could you tell us a little bit more about his background, who he was, what his aims were in Lebanon, and what, if any, connection he may have had to this bombing?
Yeah, so he's a ruthless dictator. I mean, he's basically Syria's ruler, and he basically wants a big slice of Lebanon. And so back during the era of the Ottoman Empire, Syria controlled an area that was called Greater Syria, and so they controlled part of what was in that time period modern Lebanon, and he wanted that back. And so he did not. And so he had an interest to go in and sort of destabilize the local weak Christian government that was still in control there. And furthermore, Assad also saw that the Christian government in Lebanon was very friendly with the Israelis. And so he did not want there to be a government in Lebanon that was friendly with Israel. He didn't want that on his border. And so he needed basically to sort of stir up and create chaos there in order to help destabilize Lebanon. Now, his role in the bombing is really sort of indirect in that the Iranians want to come in as well. And also they see an opportunity here to continue to harass and attack the Americans and the Israelis. And so they need sort of safe passage and a place to sort of set up camp to build these terror training camps. And so they're going to come through Syria and through Damascus, and then they're going to settle in this sort of lawless hinterland up sort of on the near Syria, sort of in kind of wedged between Lebanon and Syria there. And they're going to turn that area into basically a terrorism incubator. They're going to bring in a bunch of Iranian Revolutionary Guardsmen. They're going to set up these camps, and they're going to go out into Lebanon and particularly in southern Beirut, and they're going to recruit the disenfranchised Shia youth. And they're going to say, basically turn them into a homegrown army that they can then use against the Israelis and the Americans.
You write in pretty great detail the Secretary of State at the time going to Capitol Hill after the bombing, and a lot of folks in Congress, especially Democrats, but Republicans too, were demanding that the U.S. withdraw from Lebanon. Reagan did not. He held strong despite, in really great detail, the conversations he has with victims' families back in the U.S. What would be the difference in today's world had the U.S. gotten out right away?
Like you mean right after the bombing?
Yeah, if Reagan would have listened and completely withdrawn.
Yeah, I mean, quite frankly, there wasn't a big difference had he gotten out right after the bombing versus when he got out in early '84. All he did was delay the inevitable and essentially allow a number of more Marines to get killed. I think the bigger question for Reagan and his advisors was whether they should have gotten out before then. Because what happened is really when America went in on this sort of open-ended mission, the mission was basically defined as presence, which is the Marines are going to be there. And remember, it's not a huge contingency of Marines. It's just 1,800. It's one battalion. They're going to be there as a stabilizing force, a presence. Well, how do you define that exactly? And that was the big challenge that the Marines had is, well, what are we really doing here? I mean, we're riding around, we're showing the flag, but what are we doing? I mean, we're not allowed to engage. We're non-combatants. And so we're essentially, and what they ultimately became, were sitting targets. And so that there was this infighting in the Reagan administration over whether the Marines should even be there. Was it in America's strategic interest to actually interfere in Lebanon? And you had, on the one hand, you had George Shultz, who was Secretary of State, and you had Bud McFarlane, who was National Security Advisor, who very much thought that it was. They saw this as an opportunity to bring peace and stability on Israel's northern border, and basically to sort of one-up Jimmy Carter, who had successfully brought Egypt and Israel together, and they were hoping to do the same thing in Lebanon. The opposite side, you had Caspar Weinberger, who's Defense Secretary and Joint Chiefs of Staff, who said that Lebanon had no strategic value to the United States, and that we were taking our eyes off the ball of the bigger conflict, which was the Cold War, and that we risked getting pulled into a proxy conflict. Because, of course, while we backed Lebanon, the Soviets backed Syria. He said, basically, this is not the best use. So they had all this constant back and forth, this infighting inside the Reagan administration over what to do. And that, as that's unfolding, as that battle is sort of playing out, the situation in Lebanon is getting worse and worse by the day. And what Reagan did is for all of his great personal strengths and his charisma, he did not like conflict. And so Shultz and Weinberger had a really bad personal history. They'd been competitors throughout their careers.
Worked at the same company.
Yeah, they'd both been executives at Bechtel. I mean, these guys were, and they're both like sort of dominant personalities. Big egos. And so, for them, it was this personal grudge match. And so, when they would get into it, Reagan would just shut down. Instead of saying, instead of sort of using that, he would just look for compromise or just not engage. And what happened is through that type of sort of administrative behavior, nothing happened. It created impasse. And that impasse led to the Marines just getting stuck there. And so as things got worse and worse and worse, of course, the Marines are getting pulled more and more and more into it. they missed that opportunity to say, hey, maybe we should get out of here.
I think a better question would have been, were there downsides to getting out? We saw then in 2000 the attack on the USS Cole. Obviously, we withdrew right away. 9/11, I think their rationale was we would also leave. Did we show ourselves to be a paper tiger by leaving that quickly?
Yeah, and it's not so much about leaving, but it's the failure to retaliate, I think.
Right.
That's probably one of the stronger messages there. And that was a big sticking point, inside the National Security Council staff at that point. Because, we did pull out. And not only did we pull out, and quite frankly, by the time we pulled out, there was not much left of Lebanon. The military had collapsed, the government had collapsed. I mean, it was a quasi-failed state at that point. There was nothing left for us to prop up and stabilize. But we missed an opportunity to actually go back and retaliate. And there had been plans drawn up to go and strike those terror training camps in the hinterlands there. And the National Security Council staff wanted to do that. But Weinberger didn't want to do it. And nor did the Joint Chiefs. They said, you know what? All we're doing is risking escalation. And the further we go up the escalatory ladder, the more chances of us getting drawn in. We just need to cut our losses and leave. And that's the advice Reagan followed. And by not retaliating and sort of the way we handled that, it certainly sent a message to the terrorists that, hey, this works. For the very inexpensive price of a truck, some explosives, and the life of one volunteer, you can literally completely impact American foreign policy. And not only will the Americans leave, there's no repercussions. There's no consequences. So you can get away with it. And so, instead, had America, gone and blown up the terror camps or, execute or, gone and done some surgical strikes against the Iranians, it might have sent a different message. But we pulled out. And as a result of that, it sort of emboldened the Iranians. And you began to see sort of the exporting of that type of terrorism throughout the region. And that's something we've been dealing with ever since.
Now, what you're talking about, of course, is a suicide attack. And yes. I'm very curious in the origins of this tactic because suicide, I believe, is prohibited by the Quran.
Yes.
Can you explain how the political climate of that period allowed this sort of change in religious interpretation and just the rise of the style of attack in general?
Yeah. So I'm not a theologist, and so I'm not an expert in that. But Carson, you bring up a good point. I mean, this really is the beginning of suicide attacks. And Lebanon was considered the car bomb capital of the world at that point. I mean, it's car bombs were ubiquitous. They blew up Tom Friedman's house, the New York Times columnist. Back then, he was just a beat reporter. I mean, these things went off so often. There was actually a cottage industry of people whose job it was to diffuse car bombs, and that's how common they were. And so, but the difference was those were stationary. They were cars that were parked. They were then remotely detonated. And the big change is the attack on the U.S. Embassy in April of 1983. And of course, that is a suicide bomber in a vehicle. And there had been another attack against an Israeli building just a few months before that. That's really the beginning of the change. And the U.S. and even the Lebanese were really slow to grasp that. And in fact, actually, the Lebanese told the Americans, they said, the car bomb against the embassy, it's a car bomb. It's a little different, but, we get car bombs all the time. And so nobody quite appreciated the gravity of this change in sort of how the terrorists were going to attack until after the embassy. I mean, after the Marine headquarters and barracks bombing. And so it did. It ushered in a whole new form, which of course you're going to see echoed throughout the next, several decades with 9/11, the Cole, and many other of these types of attacks. So, but that is really the beginning. Lebanon's the beginning of it.
It's interesting that it was the beginning, but certainly not the end. Given the attack in 83, should the U.S. have been better prepared for the USS Cole for 9/11? Why did they miss it, given that this was a known thing?
So when we were working on this book, we were going through the congressional. So of course, like any big issue like this, any big sort of attack like this, of course, it's going to lead to congressional testimony and hearings and things like that. And General Paul Kelly, who was the commandant of the Marine Corps, gets summoned before Congress in November of 1983. Of course, he's testifying in front of lawmakers, and they're kind of drilling down on questions about, security at the building, the gates, things like that, the Marines, the rules of engagement. And Kelly really recognized that this was not just a one-off, that this was more than just an attack, that this was a really the coming of a new form of warfare. And when you're reading his testimony, he gets very, very frustrated with the lawmakers, because the lawmakers, even though he's trying to say, hey, this is a bigger deal than just this one attack, we need to be changing a lot of things in order to guard against this. The lawmakers kept wanting to go back to these sort of minute issues about security and rules of engagement. And finally, he gets frustrated, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, what's it going to take? Is a suicide bomber and an airplane for people to wake up and realize that this is a new war? And that's 18 years before 9/11. And he's effectively predicted it. But everybody was slow to grasp the changing dynamics at that point in the Middle East and what was happening. But he pretty much called it. So,
could we speak a little bit more about the impact the attack had on George Shultz and his thinking? Are there any palpable ways that the bombing kind of haunts his judgment going forward for the rest of his tenure as Secretary of State?
Yeah, so I think Schultz is in Weinberger, of course, the two rivals there. Schultz really kind of felt all throughout and through the rest of his career, and wrote about in his memoirs that that they were doing the right thing in Lebanon and whatnot. And even though Weinberger and the Joint Chiefs were very much against it. And you really don't see much of a change in Schultz's thinking, even though later on a lot of Reagan advisors would write in their memoirs and say, we screwed up in Lebanon, it wasn't worth it, and things like that. Schultz really never goes there. I think the biggest change that you really see that comes out of Lebanon really comes from Weinberger, not Schultz. And Weinberger comes out of that with the Weinberger Doctrine. And of course, the Weinberger Doctrine is basically the lessons learned of Lebanon, which is you can't go in there with an ill-defined mission like presence. Like, you got to go in and you got to have a clear-cut mission. You have to define what victory is before you ever even go there. That way, when you've reached it, and when you can get out. You never go into somewhere if it is not clear-cut in the U.S. national interest. Of course, Lebanon was not. Weinberger argued that. So it's these kinds of very clear points, and about a half dozen of them that's sort of all on the same lines, that he ultimately formulates in 1984, and it's ultimately called the Weinberger Doctrine. Well, fast forward to the first Gulf War, and Colin Powell literally takes the Weinberger Doctrine and applies it. And guess what? The first Gulf War is a big success. Going with a clear defined mission, you go in, you drive Saddam Hussein out, you get out. I mean, you can argue about the ramifications and things like that afterwards and stuff like that. But from an operational standpoint, they learned the lessons. They went in, they did it, they got out. And so, and then of course, America subsequently forgot all that later on. Afghanistan, Iraq, you go back in, you just stay and things like that. But the military is really good at sort of coming up with lessons, applying them, and then forgetting them. But in that case, I think more than anything, the thinking that came out of that was more on the Defense Department side and Weinberger's side as far as lessons learned and how to apply them going forward than it was on Schultz and the State Department.
Talk a bit about President Reagan's thinking both before, during, and after the crisis. How did the event actually shift his approach to the Middle East?
Yeah, Reagan is this impacted Reagan tremendously. And I'll tell you, so Jack is friends with Michael Reagan, his son, and when we were working on the book, in fact, Michael Reagan texted Jack and he said, that his father took these Marines' lives to his grave with him. And then when Jack and I were out at the Reagan Library together last fall, Michael came and we talked to him a bit, and he reiterated those exact same points, that the legacy, that these guys' deaths was something that really anguished Reagan. And in fact, actually, when we were working on the book, we found in the Reagan Library, when he pulled the Marines out in 1984, he actually wrote up his thoughts and his feelings on it. And he never put them into a speech. He never sent them to anybody or whatnot. It was just a rough draft that he stuck aside. But effectively, it was an apology to the Marines. And he said he wrote, and again, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, that the mission we sent you on, it failed, but it was of no failure because of you all. It was bigger than you guys. It was bigger than all of us. And it was situations far beyond our control. So he was very, very, very anguished by that. But I think he learned a tough lesson here in what went on in Lebanon. And I think, there was an even bigger lesson, not just for Reagan, but for America, that when you do have troops in a situation like Lebanon, and you do have them where they're very much in harm's way, Washington has got to do a much better job of staying on top of what's going on, because the reality was things in Lebanon were shifting on, not a month by month basis, but literally a day by day, hour by hour basis as the situation was getting worse and worse and worse. In Washington, trying to manage the situation from 5,000 miles away simply couldn't keep up. And so there was a failure to appreciate by senior leaders how bad the situation was getting on the ground there and how much these Marines were in harm's way. And so that I think that was something that was a big lesson learned for all of them in Washington.
For Reagan and his senior advisors, was there a fear that this would cascade into an even, I kind of know the answer, but an even larger conflict in the region? What would that conflict have looked like?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you've got a lot of different competing interests there. You've got the Israelis, of course, who were, allied with the U.S. Were in Lebanon, of course, because after the driving out of the PLO, they were trying to prevent the land in southern Lebanon from being used by terrorists to sort of attack northern Israel. You've got the Syrians who have their interests, and of course, they're backed very much by the Russians. And of course, you have the U.S. who's there sort of on the side of the Christian government and the Israelis. So you do have sort of all these outside forces sort of in this tug of war over this one little area. So, the bigger threat, would it have pulled in Syria? Would it have pulled in the United States? I mean, it could have, but I doubt it. I mean, was Assad really somebody that Russia was going to go to war over with the U.S.? Probably not. But
almost did later.
Yeah, but they, I think if anything, what you see with the Russians and as you see them, they're writing big checks for Assad to have more weapons and things like that, because these kinds of proxy wars, they're great for attrition. And but the fact is, the U.S. didn't have enough troops on the ground at that point to have the kind of attrition that you're seeing, for instance, today in with Ukraine and Russia. So I mean, the possibility is always there, but I didn't get a sense that was a huge fear at that time, that it could spiral into something, like a World War III.
Yeah. So you write in really great detail, and you pull from a lot of personal letters. So troops writing home to their mother, their loved ones, or for those of our listeners who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, what were some of the more profound letters that you came across? And can you talk about some of the individuals who were lost in the incident?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And it's great to put that spotlight there too, because at the end of the day, I mean, when Jack and I were talking about the book and we were sort of mapping it out in the early stages, we really wanted this to be a book that the Marines were proud of, that put a spotlight on their heroism, because these guys were the ones put in harm's way, and they were the ones who suffered. And so we had phenomenal cooperation from the Marines and their families. We, as I noted earlier, we did over 100 hours of interviews with survivors. We got over 1,000 pages of letters and diaries from these guys that were there. And you got to remember, this is the era before Twitter and everything, so people weren't tweeting out their thoughts on what was going on. They were actually writing out letters and sending them home, and thankfully, those family members held on to them, because those allow us to go back and capture what it was like for those Marines in their own words. Because when you interview these guys nowadays, they're all in their early 60s, and they're looking back through the hindsight of their 40 years and how they view it. It's going to be very different than how they viewed it at 18 or 19. And so, and another great thing we got access to was a lot of these Marines. Back then, they used cassette tapes, and they would record messages to their wives and then just mail the cassette tapes back and forth. And so some of these guys still had the cassette tapes, so we were able to actually listen to them. And one of my favorites was Dr. John Hudson, who was the battalion surgeon. We had 9 hours of cassette tapes of John. And you could hear the machinery, and you could hear everything going on in the background. I mean, you could actually hear Lebanon in 1983. And you could hear his voice and his accent and all that. So it was, for us, I mean, that was a real emphasis for the story, was telling what it was like. Now, some of the stories that really stood out, one of my favorites was, of course, John Hudson. He was the battalion surgeon. He's, in a lot of ways, kind of the emotional heart of the book, and that John was a little bit older than the Marines. Of course, he was in the Navy, because the Marines don't have their own medical; they depend on the Navy. He was in his late 20s, and so he was over there. He didn't want to be in Beirut, when he got through med school and he signed up for the Navy thinking that it would be a good way to get his student loans paid off. He had no idea that the Marines didn't have their own medical and that he ran the risk of having to deploy with the Marines. And so when he found out, he was furious. He had a young infant son, and here he is on the beaches in Beirut, and he's just frustrated by the whole thing. And thankfully, John was a voracious letter writer. In fact, he wrote 640 pages of letters that his wife very generously provided us access to. And of course, John could see the writing on the wall with what was happening over there. He could see the situation was getting worse and worse because he is the one who's having to patch these guys up after they get injured. He's the one who has to pronounce them dead when they're killed. And he was furious about the situation that America was in. But sadly, he was one of the fatalities. And so his premonition that he wouldn't survive Beirut, unfortunately, was true. So John was one of my favorites. Don Howell's another one of my favorites. Don actually lives in Charleston, South Carolina, right near where I am. One of the funniest, nicest guys. Don was in the basement of the building when the terrorists hit it. The whole building came down on top of him. He's blind in one eye today, still because of it. A big rock that hit him, and he was in a pocket underground. All that acrid dust, that smell. I mean, you're choking on it. It's a pulverized building. Never even hears the blast. He just wakes up in this pocket and he just starts praying. And he says, God, get me out of here. And it's pitch black. He opens his eyes and there's this one little beam of light coming into this pocket where he is. And he follows that beam of light, digs himself out, and as a result of that, survives. And so there are tons of those kinds of just powerful, powerful stories. The guys that are buried, the guys that in their underwear, because they're, literally 6 a.m. when this bomb goes off, that are on top of this rubble pile, digging their friends out with K-bar knives. One of the guys we talked to still had scars on the tips of his fingers where he had dug at that concrete and rebar so much it had just scarred his fingers. These are incredible stories, and so that's, that for me, and I know for Jack too. I mean, that was what we wanted to accomplish with this book, was to tell those stories. I mean, the Reagan, the Schultz, the Weinberger, I mean, that of course is all the big context and why they're there and everything, but it's the heart of the story is the experience of those young Marines, those sailors, and those soldiers.
Okay. Well, James, I want to be respectful of your time. Thank you for joining us. This was certainly a very wonderful conversation. Like I said, I'd had the chance to read the book over the last few weeks, and it's just really great. For our listeners, where can they follow your other work?
Yeah, so I've got a website, jamesmscott.com. Jack's got a website as well. He's very big on social media if you want to look up his other books. I'm not as big on social media, but yeah, I would just say, go to Amazon, go to Barnes & Noble, or go to jamesmscott.com. So
wonderful. Thanks so much for the time.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to tune in next time.